So welcome to the session today. This is being run by the Education, Identities and Societies Research Group. And we have a seminar programme through our research group, and we try to have a mix of activities in terms of speakers talking about their research. We also thought, and this was Lewis's idea, I think it's fair to blame you, that it would be really helpful if we had an event for our doctoral researchers that would support them in terms of thinking about a Viva, trying to demystify it, how they might prepare for it. And we talked about, well, what might that look like? How could we run this sort of an event? And so we said, well, perhaps we could have a go at doing some kind of a mock Viva conversation between us, so that doctoral researchers could just get an opportunity of the way the questions might be framed and some of the responses. So that's really the purpose. We haven't run anything like this before, so we're going to try it out and see how it goes. In an ideal world, I think we would have really loved to have done this on campus, because the interaction within the room might have been a nice experience for everybody. So if we think this is something that's useful, I think we might try and plan that for the coming academic year to have something on campus. So that's our starting point. Now, what we wanted to do is, we have got quite a lot of doctoral researchers here. So we wanted to mix people up into groups at the start. We thought it would be a good chance just to give you the opportunity to talk with one another very briefly. And for our doctoral researchers, just to maybe come up with up to 3 things that they would find helpful, and then get a little bit of feedback on that. Then we'll move into the actual mock Viva and the conversation, and then see what it is we've picked up on in terms of the 3 things at the start of the conversation. If there are things we've maybe missed, we can go back over and just have some debrief time at the end. So this is a really informal seminar, very much structured around being a workshop type activity. So if everybody is happy with that, I'm going to pause the recording now. Right, okay, I'm just resuming the recording. Welcome back. I hope you found you had some things to talk about in the breakout room. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And welcome to those of you who've just joined us. You're very welcome into the seminar. So can I just take some pointers from you, from your discussions in the group? What were some of the things that you wanted to find out about from today? Who's going to start me off? Philip.
Yeah, I rather bamboozled my way into the leadership of this group, or rather the scribe, shall I say, not the leader. We identified first the mechanics of a Viva, how it actually works, and so from that perspective, and some insider insights. They wanted to get inside the whole process, not having been obviously involved in one before. Next question was about the range of questions that are asked, and how should a candidate respond to a particularly challenging question, which perhaps either they don't understand, or they maybe feel a little bit uncertain about in their own mind still, which at all stages of learning is not a bad thing anyway. Avoid certainty at all costs. And finally, about support. Rafika mentioned that she wanted to attend this event to support Lewis, which I thought was absolutely fabulous. And that sense of support within the process. What happens? What can you bring in to the Viva with you? Can you bring the full copy of your dissertation? How can it be demarcated, and so forth? And what happens when you're asked one of those difficult questions and you want a little bit of time and space to refer to the actual document. I have it here somewhere, you know, and the feeling of panic, you've got three very eminent people staring at you, waiting for your response. So that's broadly a summary of what we talked about.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Philip. There's some really, really helpful points there to get us started. Right, let me go to other groups. What else have we got? Paula.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, interestingly, the question about what would we like to be explored during the actual Viva is what triggered the conversation. And certainly one of the doctoral researchers in my room 4 was concerned that there might be too much of an emphasis on outcomes and not enough credence or attention paid to the actual process or the journey of kind of getting there. And although we do have some strategies in place, like the 3D researcher tool and development and all the rest of it, you know, and maybe there is a requirement that, or an understanding from supervisors, especially if you've got multidisciplinary teams, that you don't graduate without publications. So it, you know, is there too much of an emphasis on the outcomes and less on ways in which they've developed as a researcher along the way? And especially concerning was that if somebody is studying for this for 3 years, you know, they do develop incredibly as an individual researcher. But what happens if they follow one particular avenue in great depth, and yet there is so much else that is left unexplored? So that to share the failures and successes, really, and the challenges along the way. So is there room within the Viva space, I think, to be able to explore those issues?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Paula. And what I will do, I've made notes of everything that's been raised so far. So I'll make sure that we come back and attend to these at the end in light of what we've said, and you'll see where maybe there are gaps and in terms of what we have and haven't covered. Okay, that's lovely. So I'm just looking at my groups. Antonina, Deborah, your group, was there anything there to note?
I kind of tried to remember what questions I was asked in the Viva. So, yeah, so questions around methodology, that's what we discussed, I think, and Deborah shared some, you know, opening questions as well.
Yeah. I can't hear you, Deborah. I can see you talking.
Sorry. It's about, you know, what questions are likely to come up. And we were saying that there are some questions that almost always come up, standard ones, and then ones that you can't anticipate. So it'd be nice to know what are those standard likely questions. And we talked a bit about the Viva being described as defending your thesis, and what does that mean, and how we justify what we've done during the thesis. So it will be interesting to see that in action.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. And yes, I'm smiling and laughing because you're going to hear some of those standard questions from me, clearly, because although Lewis has sent me his work and I've looked over it, I'm trying to make this as relevant and as widely applicable as I can in terms of those quite standard questions, I think. Okay, so I think there's just one other group, Ruth and Asthma. Was there anything there that we need to, that I can pick up and make a note of? Hi, Ruth.
Asthma, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the buttons. Okay, for us, it's just, I mean, I wasn't as generous as Viva, that's for sure. I came here today to see the process of the Viva, how it would look like for me, because as you know, Kate, I've been wanting to submit a long time ago now, and I know it's March already, but eventually I will have to submit. So yeah, I just wanted to see what's waiting for me, really, what to expect on my Viva.
Lovely, thanks, Asthma. Thank you. Ruth?
No, nothing else. I thought it'd be useful for me to see what happens so that I can better support my doctoral students.
Lovely. Okay, that's great. Thank you all so much for that. That really helps us in terms of framing some of the aims of the session and picking up on some of the things that may or may not come up through the Viva questions. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Lewis, who's just going to briefly introduce himself and say a few things about the event today.
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, I'm Lewis, today's participant with Kate in this mock Viva. So I also work in the department. I lead the MA education program, and I'm in my final, well, just beyond my final year of my Ed D, and I hope to submit in the next couple of months. Deborah's here, as she's one of my supervisors, and I'm probably 1 or 2 drafts away from that, I'd say, maybe more, but I'm close to that. And my research is focused on constructing a shared understanding of leadership in early childhood education and care, which is essentially the portion of the education sector and care sector that caters for under 5s, like preschool age children, focused on in England, and that's the focus of my research.
And did you also want to add that none of this is scripted?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so also, when I first proposed the idea, like Kate did correctly say, I thought it might be more of a scripted endeavor. But yeah, this is completely, I don't know what Kate's going to ask me. So I'll definitely be drawing on, obviously, my work, which I have in front of me. And I didn't mention that I'm also, I own a nursery company. So I have 3 nurseries. So it's very close to what I do every day. And I think that might be something for me to negotiate throughout, that I need to make sure I draw on my research and not what happened yesterday, for example. So yeah, just a little bit of extra insight into me in this process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lewis. Thanks so much. So we're going to make a start now. Now, I have mentioned this would be different if we could role play this on campus. We could potentially have 2 of us doing the examining and a chair, because the questions about, so what are you going to walk in and find, whether that's in a virtual room or whether that's in an on-campus room, is going to be your 2 examiners, the chair, and sometimes your supervisors. They can be in the room, but they need to always be out of the line of sight, and they can be there as note takers, or they can sit in a Zoom room with their cameras and microphones off, and they can take notes. So certainly that's what I've experienced as an external examiner. The point that was raised about taking time to look at notes, obviously we won't be able to see that in person, but we'll see how we get on, and whether there are any pauses. So without any further ado, I've got 5 questions that I'm going to ask Lewis now, and we'll see how we get on in terms of responses. So the first one, very standard opening question. Can you just tell me a little bit about the work that has sparked your interest in the research that you're doing for your doctorate?
Sure. So I've worked in the early years sector for the best part of 10 years, and working with children under 5 in different capacities, both as a hands-on teacher, then as a leader, I've built up a collection of experiences, and these collection of experiences have both motivated me to carry on working in the sector, but also to begin to challenge what happens in the sector. And I think more recently, as I began to prepare for this piece of research, I was questioning whether or not my experiences were shared, whether people had different insights they could offer. And I definitely was under the impression that things weren't going in a good direction in the sector. And that's evident both in the literature and in my experiences. And this motivated me to explore in a more coherent and intellectual way what happens in the sector. What do people understand by the purpose and leadership in the sector, and what do they understand by good leadership in the sector? So I hoped that I could, scratch the itch that I had to know more about what was happening around me in my everyday life, and then also help others in the sector. From anecdotal experiences, I can see that people around the country are struggling. Managers and leaders in early years are struggling. And if something doesn't change, then I think it's going to only get harder and worse, both for those that work in the sector and the children that are in the sector. So I hope that my work can contribute to some positive nudge away from a potentially sad future, I suppose.
That's great. So just a brief little follow-up question on that one.
Mm.
So you mentioned there that there's struggle and people are struggling within the sector. Can you just say a little bit more about that? What's the struggle? What are the tensions underpinning that struggle?
Sure. So the tensions that have come out in my work and my experiences are centered around policy and connected to that funding and regulation in the sector. So Ofsted regulate the sector, and funding is integral to the workings of the sector. There's a childcare market where we have over 10 different types of provisions that do different things for different parts of the country and different parts of even towns. So you might have a private day nursery that runs 8 till 6 all year round versus a maintained nursery school that operates like a school hour basis. And these two settings are held under to the same standards by and large, but for example would receive different funding rates, or would receive or be expected to have different levels of qualification of their staff. So on the one hand, you've got a sector that's trying to do the same thing, but then you've got these mechanisms like qualifications and funding and regulation that have different impacts within the sector. And this means that there's this confusion about what people should be doing and how they're doing it with regards to pedagogy, their actual teaching, the curriculum that they implement. That there is a national curriculum in early years foundation stage, but then there's different guidance that government offer and other organizations offer that add to the noise for those that work in the sector trying to understand what they're doing. And this just results in it's a sector that's hard for even people that work in the sector to understand. So if you're a parent looking to place a child in the setting, you're left with either just choosing your local one, or if you're able to understand a bit more, you might be able to shop around a bit. But I think there's definitely this tension between, is it there to educate and care? Is it there to provide parents with a support so they can work? And this plays out in different ways, in ways that I've mentioned.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. So lots of issues there, lots of things in the mix in terms of influences on the sector. So tell me now, just thinking a little bit about the literature review, how have you used the existing literature to shape your thinking and focus in this work?
Sure. So my literature has definitely developed over time, and even to the past couple of months, developing my understanding of policy and policy enactment, for example. I might regret mentioning that because you might ask me more about it now. But for me, there's a lot of literature about the impact of policy, funding, regulation on the sector. There's less literature about the impact this is having on the people. So the first part of my literature review focused on the things I've mentioned: policy, funding, regulation, purpose, pedagogy. And the second part focused on the individuals and their leadership responsibility. To date, leadership literature and that focusing on the individuals seem to be more done to them rather than done with them, which will connect to the idea of my participatory methodology. But the literature review was informed by this introductory work that existing literature has done that says, for example, existing understandings of leadership are not adequate. But then they stop. They don't go on to say how they're inadequate or what can be done to make them more adequate. And there's a tendency to look elsewhere in education to borrow ideas, which on the one hand can be fine, but I think for early years it's so nuanced. With 97% female workforce, for example, it's different, and that gender element definitely comes through my literature review as well and helps shape my literature review. And trying to develop a new way of thinking about individuals and their leadership responsibilities came through towards the end of my literature review, but that bit was very much an introductory idea of what we can do differently. And existing literature didn't answer questions to go beyond what can we actually do as leaders in the sector to improve sustainability, to improve well-being of staff, and those sorts of questions. So I was shaped along the way by gender, by policy, by questions being unanswered, and that led into my methodology and my research.
Okay, that's great. So just give me one or two examples of key people in terms of their work and the influence on you, just as a follow-up question.
Sure. So Campbell Barr is a researcher that focused on entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial elements in the sector, and she introduced it, well, she made it clear the idea that there's a price on the children's head in early years, which is an uncomfortable reality for somebody working in the sector and possibly those listening now. And her work talks about that we cannot escape the entrepreneurial element for early years, but the inherent nature of those that work in the sector do not embrace that entrepreneurial element. So her work's been really influential in ensuring that the entrepreneurial element of leadership is recognized and was investigated. So that's one, and that could be referred to almost as the elephant in the room. And then also on the other side of that, pedagogical leadership, which could be seen as a pedagogical versus entrepreneurial leadership, and the work of Mail, and I'm definitely not going to say this name right, but Palais-Lagou. So these two people have done different types of research either together or separately, but their work has not only methodologically in terms of praxeology and this sort of stuff, but in terms of pedagogical leadership, there's so many different iterations of what pedagogical leadership is, but they took it to another level, I suppose, to really investigate it as a praxis concerned with actions and processes in constructing and deconstructing knowledge. And they really brought context in as well. So their research is situated in early years. And their work really, I guess, when I read it for the first time, made me think, oh my God, this is just, what have I found here? It's brilliant. And then through working with my supervisors, I problematized that a bit more and understood there were still gaps. And those gaps were around entrepreneurial leadership. So I think together, the work of Campbell Barr and Mail and Palais-Lagou provide the most complete picture possible in existing literature of what leadership in early years is. So those two people, I'd say, are very, eminent in my work.
Great, thank you very much. Now, you mentioned before that the literature review had led into the shaping of your research design in terms of the doing to rather than working with element of participatory research. And I've noted in your methodology all the strengths of that approach. But I wonder, can you just talk us through what are the actual limitations of doing a piece of research like that?
Sure. So for me, the limitations have, it's hard to know when but one thing I keep getting criticized for, well, not criticized, because Deborah's sitting there, it's a very supportive environment that Deborah and Anne create in my supervisions, but it's my being so close to this research has meant that sometimes it's not clear whether I'm saying it, whether my data has said it, whether the literature is saying it. And I think a limitation in some sense is being so close to the work and being able to separate myself from it. But in terms of the methodology, the mechanisms of my methodology more specifically, I think that the work that I'm trying to strive to be inherently participatory, but then at the same time, I have to analyze the work. I have to offer my explications of their work. So I have to go beyond the data in some ways and doing that thoughtfully. For example, I didn't present my participants with their data, which could have been a way in some, there is evidence that suggests doing that would support the participatory and those strengthen that side of my work. But I didn't do that because I felt that they had the opportunity to share their views with me. And then it was down to me to ensure that I recognize my positionality and do that in a thoughtful way. And I've tried to do that through drawing on the work of Now et al. In terms of thoughtfulness. I really try to focus on the relationships of my participants, and over Zoom, that's challenging. A limitation is certainly that I wasn't able to go ahead with my initial plan to do walking interviews, where I hope to walk with my participants through their settings. And in the end, I had to do it over Zoom, which meant I couldn't be with them in their environment where I hoped they felt safer and more secure. So more work had to be done to encourage comfort and control from them in terms of the narrative. And so I hope that responds to your question.
I'm going to pick you up on just a small point there and just
Sure.
probe a little bit more. So I mean, one of the things someone like Kirsch, who's a feminist scholar, would say is that actually when you make those data interpretations, it's a really good idea to check back in, or certainly to offer the opportunity to participants to check back in terms of the representations you're making of them, just so that they can recognise are they accurate portrayals. So what would you say to that in terms of limitations?
Yeah, and I think until I discovered the work of Dowling Nass, I was in that camp, and I probably would have tried harder to just get it back, my data back to them. But the work of Dowling Nass, she did some really interesting work with a PE teacher's narratives, where she had the original narrative and then she essentially offered a contrasting interpretation of that case, with the aim of kind of kindling critical reflection. And I think she did this because she was under the view that the PE teacher in focus had a limited access to power within her structure, and she experienced things very differently as a result of her position. And it's a very difficult line to tread. Even in my supervision this morning, actually, we were speaking about how we're trying to balance this idea of you've said this and rather than you said this but, in terms of your participants saying something and then you coming back at it. So the work of Dowling Nass did that, I think, in a critical but fair way, to try to suggest there's things beyond the scope of interest for individuals when they talk about their stories, their narratives, and their lived experiences. And I try to thoughtfully add some layers to theirs, without taking away from the original narrative. I tried to add some layers of understanding and explication to them, without silencing what was originally said. I think that's really important. That is still there in my data and findings and assertions.
Great, thank you. All right, so just moving us on a little bit now, just talk me through, how did you select the data that you've presented to ensure that it's representative of your sample and your themes?
So I did an awful lot of work using numbers, just like Excel, and essentially I got very close to the data, thinking about Braun's work and trying to get really close to the data. It becomes your best friend. At first it's a stranger, then at the end you know it better than yourself. And it was this case of just rereading and rereading, and I identified themes, sub-themes. I started to connect, just connect as much as possible between my participants and what they had found. And the best thing I could do to describe is this idea of like an analytical map, where I identified how often something was said and by how many people. So, for example, pedagogical influences was a real strong element of the purpose of ECEC in my participant data. And that was said 37 times by all 15 participants. So that had to have a place in my work and in my findings, and down to the lesser, for example, money talks but not loud enough was another theme about money. That was mentioned only 15 times by 8 people. So I had, I guess, a sort of threshold. I obviously can't talk about everything that was said. So it was me actually numerically assessing how frequent something was mentioned and by how many people. And then that gave it the strength to be present in my findings.
That's great. So it's that numerical way of working, of saying, actually, these are the dominant themes, and I'm going to include these thematically.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of questions left now. So the penultimate question I'm going to ask you is, how did you then talk us through how you used your theoretical framework across your data chapters to make sense of some of that data?
Sure. So I found it best to just, in my discussion chapter, to essentially structure it around my research questions. And it meant that I was able to, for example, bring in themes like gender, feminist work, context, policy enactment throughout. And the structure really, as I said, centered around those questions. And then the themes that were identified. So I mentioned pedagogical influences. So because that was like 38 iterances from 15 participants. That was the highest value item that was in my first section of my discussion. So I then followed that journey through the different values, setting vision, parent power, policy, the threat and opportunity of qualifications, which led to this idea of the professional knowledge landscape. So I tried to follow the analysis from my data and then knock that against my literature review, which for this research question in particular was quite supportive of what was out there. And affirmed what was said, but it wasn't brought together in a coherent way. And I tried to do that under the professional knowledge landscape, where I offer essentially a diagram that captures the complexity of the professional knowledge landscape in the sector. So this is where I go beyond existing literature to offer something new in response to my first research question about the lived experience of purpose in the sector. And this was also true for the leadership realities, my second research question, and then good leadership. So I felt that my discussion chapter, findings and discussion chapter, coherently, cogently offers a response to my research question, complements the literature that's existing, but then goes beyond that slightly. But then I was left with some things that weren't in existing literature, a relatively new idea all by itself, which was this idea of professional confidence. So then I had a final section of my discussion chapter that dug into this idea of professional confidence, again linking it where possible to existing literature, but more around my data to explicate what I mean by professional confidence, as I feel that is probably the biggest offering my thesis has to new knowledge for the sector.
Okay, so just pulling us back then a tiny bit to think about the theoretical framework. Where does this idea of professional confidence sit within that? You mentioned feminist theories. I know you're looking at policy enactment theory. How does that link up?
Yeah, so the idea of professional confidence is very individual, and I think that links to the complexity, for example, feminist pragmatist work that was underpin my work. It embraces the pluralism, it embraces lived experience, and the notion of professional confidence is very situated within the individual, and therefore within the context in which they work, and context sat around all of this, the idea of a marginalized sector. So the notion of trying to develop someone's professional confidence in a context where they are marginalized is challenging. And three elements within my framework as well were ethics, reflexivity, and power. And professional confidence tries to speak to the importance of reflexivity, being an ethical leader, the notion of power and how power can sit with every individual. And then another element of my framework was praxeology, and that's profoundly and intensely participatory, and it's about producing your own knowledge and actions that can be useful. And I think the notion of professional confidence is about empowering the individuals in the sector to produce their knowledge, to be active, intensely active, to work towards this reframing of purpose and leadership for the betterment of the sector and the children. So I hope that better responds to the question.
That's great, thank you so much. And the final question, you've touched on this already, but can you just please pull together your original contribution to knowledge through this work?
Yes, so it's hard to, I think sometimes, you work so hard on something for so many years, and then you have to offer something meaningful at the end. And I have essentially I have 5 assertions that I offer as a result of my work. And I think perhaps in the interest of time, I'll focus on the professional confidence one that I just mentioned. And this assertion is that having professional confidence is being aware of the injustice and confusions in the sector and actively correcting them through thoughtful and skillful advocacy for collective action, working towards a better future for early years, ECEC. And in order to achieve this, my research has shown that we need to break down the barriers both contextually and individually by continuous good leadership, through continuous working to enhance professional confidence. There's going to be a cycle that's going to take a while to get there, but through breaking down these barriers, through reducing the leadership challenges, through good leadership, through developing professional confidence, we can be left with a desired outcome where there's individual networks that are strong, there's networks across contexts that are strong, and there's generally a more shared, coherent and collaborative lived experience for the workforce. And that's, I hope, the most meaningful contribution I can make to the sector as a result of my research.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for answering all of my questions. And of course, what would happen now is if we were in a room, you would be asked to wait outside while the examiners deliberate on their responses, and in a Zoom room, you would be put in the waiting room while they deliberate. So in terms of procedural aspects, I'm just going to give you a round of applause. Well done. Really, really good effort.
Thank you.
Really well done. So what we're going to do now is pop you back into those groups and just for 2 or 3 minutes to see what now, are there new questions? Are there other points that we would like to raise? Give Lewis just a moment to gather his thoughts, and then we will come back and have a debrief for the last 10 minutes. So I'm just going to pause my recording. Welcome back, everyone. Really lovely to see you all. So, comments, anything anyone would like to raise? Paula?
Well, I can start because I was back with Faina, and one concern she raised was how eloquently Lewis was able to explain and discuss everything, very much on point. But what happens when their English is not their native language and they may struggle in terms of being understood or being able to explain and respond appropriately to questions that might be raised?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. Because we don't have long, so I think what we'll do is we'll respond quite quickly, just in the few minutes that we do have left. Lewis, I don't know if you want to say anything about the experience of losing your thread there, and even.
Yeah, so there was points where I did start to think, well, am I actually answering Kate's question here, and where am I going with it? And I wasn't sure whether I should carry on down that path, being a bit tripping myself up with my thoughts, or should I just say, can I start again? But I mean, Kate and I were just speaking there, and actually it might have been good just to show that awareness when I finished speaking, to say like, oh, have I appropriately captured the response to your question there, and sort of invite the opportunity to say something again. And yeah, I was glad that Kate asked me follow-up questions, because it meant I could just clarify my own thoughts. So I guess the opportunity to invite that might be useful if you need sort of another go at it.
I think this is a great idea, actually. Thank you.
But I do think it's a very good point, and I do think if we did this event again, it would be great to have, well, we would certainly have a different examiner and student, or researcher rather, so we can think about this in terms of how we configure the next one. Thank you, Paula. And what about any of the other groups? So Deborah, anything?
Yeah, hi,
maybe Zachariah, would you like to answer as our student person in the group?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. Thank you, Dr. Kate, and thank you, Lewis. I really liked your pace. And when we were discussing in the breakout room, we did highlight on where you paused. And I think that pause was really insightful, because you could see your mind ticking over, and how you then came back with the response. You were able to show that you've read the literature, you're well immersed in it, and yeah, I was really impressed by your delivery and your confidence. And you did say, I picked up maybe once or twice, I hope that has answered your question. So well done.
Thank you. That's really kind. And just to pick up, maybe if it's okay, Kate, and what you said there about like knowing the literature, demonstrating you read it, and confidence. I think for me, it was, I mentioned with my data that I became best friends with it. I think my challenge, and probably colleagues in here that are towards Viva stage now, the challenge is to stay close to all of your work and to stay best friends with the literature review in the same way you are with your conclusion, because I think I've found it's easy to lose sight of what your literature review was, because you might have done that a year ago. So that helped me today, like because I'm still good friends with my literature review, to put it like that.
Great, thank you. And Philip, anything from your group there, from your conversations?
Yes, we're pleased to tell you, Lewis, that absolutely wonderful confidence oozed. Minor amendments only, just a few small typos. Yeah, we were genuinely struck by the precision and confidence with which you answered the questions. There were a couple of surprises. That was one of the things we concentrated on. Surprised that there wasn't rather more about looking at data selection and your strategy for choices there, and also the rationale for the methodology. But generally, I think we were really all very, very positive about the way in which you were able to keep on track, really, which sometimes can be a real difficulty when you start ambling off down a side route, and asking for direction, I think, and stopping is always a useful thing to remember as a device in our locker. So thanks very much, Lewis. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. That's fantastic. I was looking back at the points raised at the start of the session, so giving a bit of an insight into the mechanics of a Viva. So I'm hoping that we've done that. Philip, you raise a good point there. I didn't ask too many questions about methodology, and perhaps if we do this again, we can make the session slightly longer so that we could cover a bit more. But I'm very mindful as well for the doctoral researcher that that's a big ask. So it's just finding that balance. I'm hoping that it gave a bit of a sense of the range of questions asked across the different chapters, again, even if it's only a small sense of that. There were points, weren't they, about what you bring into the Viva, and I'm going to defer to Lewis in just a second to talk about
Sure.
that. And also, if you have a question that you're struggling with and you do need to take a pause, I do think that's completely valid in the Viva process, and it's fine to just be honest and say that. So I think there was a point about, what if you don't understand how the question is framed? I think it's fine to ask for it to be rephrased and reframed. Examiners will understand that and should be able to do that. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Lewis, your reflections then, just for the last minute or two.
Yeah, sure. So I've included some already in response to the other questions, but what's left to say, I think, is what I brought in to prepare for this. And I think my biggest preparation was staying close to my work continuously, even if it's just 20 minutes a day, just to stay close to it. But then in front of me on my laptop screen now, I've got diagrams. I need a lot of diagrams to summarize, for example, methodological framework. That's in front of me. My assertions, my 5 assertions, that's in front of me, those key points. But what I found actually really helpful was the contents page. I've got quite a detailed contents page. So when Kate asked about my literature review, I could just look at that snapshot from the contents page and then know that I've covered the range of it. And when she asked for me to talk about, when Kate asked me to talk about like the kind of eminent scholars in my work, I clicked on one of those contents pages, and then I saw some names actually, and they because I knew where I wanted to go with it, but it was helpful to have that quick access to just find out that a bit more. And that's maybe one question, Kate, just to come back at you to end with, maybe, is that I wasn't sure how much to talk like that. Campbell Barr said this, West said that, so maybe that's just one final question I still have in my mind about it.
Yeah, I think that was a really good example of you showing, because we were talking about the fact that you can't cover everything. So being able to pull out and exemplify some key points, key literature. But what I really liked there was how you differentiated it. So they said, over here, X, Y, and Z, but my work is going to go further than that, and it's going to build on it. And I think a few examples like that are really helpful. So you certainly can take your thesis in, and I remember mine was all tagged so that I could get to different sections easily. And I thought, what a great idea to have the contents page there in front of you as a prompt. So these are some of the practical strategies that you can deploy. And just the final thing that I think we haven't talked about was when I put you into the breakout rooms for the second time, I said to Lewis, can you remember anything you've just said? And he's like, oh, I can remember bits of it. And I think there's a real moment when you come out of your Viva, most people feel this, that you can't remember everything. So if you can have your supervisor in the room making notes, it's always really helpful to then, you know, have a debrief after so they can give you the sense of where you did well and areas to work on. But that's everything I want to say. Lewis, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you for the comments in the chat, and for those of you that were here. It was nice to be able to do it in front of people, and I hope it was useful. It certainly was selfishly helpful for me as well, and I'm sure it will be for those who can access the recording as well. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Lewis, for being such a good sport with this. Really appreciate it. Lovely to see everybody, and look forward to seeing you all soon. As soon as we have another session, we'll advertise it so doctoral researchers will come to hear of it, and we'll make the recording available on the EIS web pages at least.
Brilliant.
Great, thank you. Nice to see everyone.
Thank you.